By that time, 250,000 Arabs had already been expelled from their homes, and by the end of the war that followed, 750,000 Arabs had been ethnically cleansed, never allowed to return.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to that great podcast in the sky, And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and I am thrilled to have on the line today Jeremy R. Hammond. Jeremy is an independent journalist, and he exposes dangerous mainstream propaganda that serves to manufacture consent for criminal government policies. I love that description. We need more of those people in our lives. He's also an author, and his latest book is Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we are going to be talking about today. Thank you for being on And If Love Remains, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Just to quickly clarify, that's not my latest book, but it is the main book I've written on the topic of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I do have more recent ones, but this is the big one that I wrote, my magnum opus, if you will, on this particular topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely pertinent today. Today.
Yes.
So I want to ask you. I want to start with this. What do American politicians mean when they say Israel and the United States have a quote special relationship? We hear that in context of Great Britain, which I kind of understand, from it's kind of our mother country in a way. But when they're talking about our relationship is to Israel, why is that considered a special relationship?
Well, the special relationship, the nature of it is that the U.S. supports Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. It does so financially, militarily, and diplomatically, and that is the nature of the so-called special relationship. I think the term special relationship and why it's considered special, apart from the uniqueness of it, the aspect of it where it's supporting crimes against the Palestinians, is I think it stems from the Christian background in the United States and the kind of the Christian view of Israel as the establishment of Israel, as a fulfillment of prophecy among evangelical Christians. They have this viewpoint, and they have a huge, this Christian Zionist lobby, if you will, has a huge influence, particularly in the Republican Party, but among Democrats as well. And so the U.S. government has this policy, and I think it's this idea that the quote unquote Jewish state is supposed to be, and the Palestinians who were expelled from their homes in order for the Jewish state to come into existence just have to get over it. And so that's the nature of the special relationship. And so what I'm referring to is, of course, in 1948, Israel came into existence through the ethnic cleansing of most of the Arab population from their homes in Palestine. That is how Israel was created. There's a myth that it was created by the UN. That's false. And what that refers to is UN Resolution, General Assembly Resolution 181. But that resolution, contrary to popular myth, it neither created Israel nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for their May 14th, 1948 unilateral declaration of the existence of Israel, which had no legal power. There was no legal authority behind that declaration. It was just a unilateral declaration in which the Zionists proclaimed sovereignty over land that wasn't theirs. And then by that time, by the end of the mandate, which the declaration came on the same date as the mandate expired, the British belligerent occupation of Palestine under the League of Nations mandate, which was then transferred to the UN. By that time, 250,000 Arabs had already been expelled from their homes. And by the end of the war that followed, 750,000 Arabs had been ethnically cleansed, never allowed to return. And so this is the fundamental root cause of the conflict, was that the Palestinians, the Arabs Palestinians, were denied the right to self-determination after World War I and World War II as a result of the British belligerent occupation of Palestine, specifically for the purpose of denying their rights in order to facilitate the establishment of this Jewish state.
Right. I think um, I've had many arguments with people lately about that idea, because sometimes we get lost in the minutia of um, this Security Council allowed this, and the UN allowed that, and the British and the Ottoman Empire, and we get all of these things, but I try to get back to a fundamental level of if I own a piece of property, no matter who is the authority figure over that land, I own that piece of property. And you can say, well, under the law of might make right, somebody can kick you off the land, but that doesn't make it moral nor legal. And I think, until we actually come to terms with real people who lost real land at a real time, and not that can be solved necessarily at this point, but at least we can have an acknowledgement of what's going on and where these things come from.
Right. Yeah. And the historical context is so critical. And the big problem is that most of what people think they know about the conflict isn't true, because Western media parrot Zionist propaganda narratives. And the reason for that is because Western governments have, since its inception, supported the Zionist movement. And so we have this distorted view of the conflict through the lens of government officials in the West who support, who are apologists for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and then the mainstream media, which of course report on the conflict through this Western lens. So it's this is the problem.
Yeah, and I want to address a little bit the religious aspect that you mentioned, especially among evangelicals, because so for example, for me, I'm a religious person. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has a whole other baggage, a literary baggage when it comes to Zion, gathering of Israel, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
These terms means very specific things, and are very important to my religion as well. But I think it's super important that we get clear on, first of all, separating, God's will and the UN will, for example, and also trying to understand, how, man, we've got to acknowledge the wrongs that were done, and come to term with those, and say, wait, maybe God's will is supposed to happen in another way than throwing people off their own land.
Yeah, this is a really good point. It's a really important point to make that, at the time, when the Zionist movement was founded, it was actually opposed by the religious Jewish communities, particularly the ultra-Orthodox communities, because they saw this political Zionism, which was a secular movement, as rebelliousness against the will of God. Because the way they saw it, the way they interpreted the scriptures, Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was that they had to await the coming of the Messiah to be able to return for the nation of Israel to be reborn. And so, in their view, the Zionist movement was an attempt by secular Jews to rebel against God and reestablish Israel on their own without God. And so it was really sacrilegious to a lot of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And so this is really important to understand. And to this day, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who maintain that view. Who are anti-Zionist. On the other hand, you have ultra-Orthodox Jews who are very extreme. They're the extremist religious Jews in Israel today, who are really represented by the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu. And these are like the extremist settlers who they want to, this ties directly into the terrorist attacks of October 7th, because if you look at the name of that operation, Hamas called it Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So that's referencing the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, or the Temple Mount in East Jerusalem. And so the I think one of the main reasons that Hamas launched this operation was the threat being made to the Temple Mount by this group of ultra-Orthodox extremist Jews who aim to destroy the mosque to
Right.
be able to rebuild the Jewish temple.
Right.
And so there was this. They had announced just like a couple of weeks, I think it was, before the Operation Al-Aqsa flood. This community had announced, the Temple Institute is called, had announced its acquisition of 4 red heifers, and this is part of the prophecy that they have to sacrifice a red heifer. And then I don't know the exact details, but spread its ashes, something like this, and then that will purify. It's an act of purification so that Jews can then return to that land, because they're actually not supposed to step foot into the area of the temple in an unclean state, and so this sacrifice is a purification ritual to enable them to then rebuild the temple. And so it's a step toward fulfillment of the prophecy in the view of these this kind of the settler, the religious settler community in the West Bank.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think especially for us Americans, like I really, I just had Scott Horton on who talked a little bit about some of the history, which was fantastic. And we'll get into that too. But I want to focus more on the United States role in this, because, what are our tactics? What are we paying for? I think if people, it's really important that people take this opportunity to look into their hearts and see, like, what is it that we are doing. And I would even say, even to the state of Israel, I mean, this is dangerous times for everybody. And I think even if you're you think that Israel, should have its own, or, the Jewish people should have its own state, this is really dangerous what America is doing. So can you talk a little bit about America's role right now, and how we're, what is America doing?
Yeah, well, initially, as I was discussing earlier, the biggest supporter of the Zionist movement, of course, was Great Britain. That really got taken over by the United States, especially after the 1967 war, which was started by Israel on the morning of June 5th, 1967, with a surprise attack on Egypt that destroyed its air force while its planes were still on the ground. The CIA had accurately predicted that if war was going to break out, it would be started by Israel, and that Israel, because of its superior military power, would defeat the combined Arab armies within a week or two. This, of course, is what's called the Six-Day War in Israel. Following the war, UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which emphasized the principle of international law, that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And having emphasized that principle, called on Israel to withdraw to the pre-June 5th armistice lines, which are the same thing, sometimes called the Green Line, also known as the 1949 armistice lines. Israel has remained in violation of that resolution ever since, because Israel rejects the Security Council's intent of that resolution, and it has its own unilateral interpretation of the resolution, whereby it's not required to withdraw, and it can maintain its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip until such time as their negotiations can occur to arrive at some kind of peace settlement.
Now,
so in other words,
that they need that extra land as a buffer, is that the claim out there?
Yeah, there's the land for peace
Right.
framework. So in other words, it's a rejection of the applicability of international law, because not all of it's in the media. This is an example of the media's bias and prejudice against the rights of the Palestinians, because you'll often hear it. New York Times constantly refers to like East Jerusalem, for example, as quote unquote disputed territory, but this is false. Under international law, all of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are occupied Palestinian territories. There's no dispute about that. That's just a point of fact. So you can see how, but Israel rejects that framework. It rejects the applicability of international law. And so its unilateral interpretation of Resolution 242 is that the people in the occupied territories must negotiate with the occupying power over how much of their own land they're allowed to remain living in. So that's the essential nature of what's called the peace process. So the U.S. Initially voted in favor of UN Resolution 242 with full understanding of what the intent of that resolution was and what the meaning of it is. However, under the peace process, despite having words about supporting UN Resolution 242, in effect, they're rejecting Resolution 242 and accepting Israel's unilateral interpretation of it. And so the entire purpose of the so-called peace process, the U.S.-led process, has been it is the means by which Israel and its superpower benefactor have always blocked implementation of the two-state solution. And the two-state solution is essentially means withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories, so that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, that territory can exist as a sovereign independent state of Palestine. And so this is an outcome that Israel has rejected, and the U.S. has supported Israel in its rejectionism.
Okay. And I think, again, from the outside, from what mainstream media portrays and what we all hear, it's portrayed as if America is kind of an honest broker trying to broker peace between two parties. And what's interesting is and I know Scott Horton makes this point of if Israel says that we can someday have a two-state solution, well, that implies, and it's not a two-state solution, that it is, because they don't have civil rights. It is essentially an apartheid situation there. And I don't think there's any way you can get around those facts.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you just used the phrase "a two-state solution," which is correct. Under the peace process, they refer to a two-state solution, but there's huge difference. There's a world of difference between a two-state solution that's supported by Israel and the U.S. and the two-state solution.
Okay.
So the two-state solution is again premised in the applicability of international law. That is what is reflected in UN Resolution 242. That's the two-state solution, where the international community has called for an independent state of Palestine consisting of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. Okay, that's the two-state solution. Israel rejects the two-state solution, and it calls for a two-state solution, or it has, at this point, the Israeli government has long since rejected even a two-state solution. But while the peace process was still kind of alive, they would, have words about a two-state solution. But it was a situation where they were demanding that the Palestinians surrender sovereignty in their so-called state. The West Bank would be still divided, broken up into where you had these, Jewish settlement blocks with Jew-only highways. The Palestinian state could have no armed forces.
Which is a problem down the line. I mean, it's that's all that's going to do is, because you're going to have people encroaching on that all the time.
Yeah, it was essentially Israel demanding major additional concessions from the Palestinians. And of course, this is another example of the Western media's prejudice against Palestinians' rights, because you'll hear constantly the media will say that Israel has offered concessions to the Palestinians. This is one of the Zionist propaganda narrative talking points that Israel has repeated. The Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. This is utter complete nonsense, and it's just ahistorical, because in every single instance, what Israel was offering, it wasn't an offer. It was a demand it was ultimatums for the Palestinians to surrender more of their rights and more of their land. So, from the perspective, it's a concession only from the perspective of what Israel wants, but the proper framework for discussion is not what Israel wants, but what both parties are entitled to. And under international law, Israel isn't entitled to a single inch of Gaza or the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So again, it's just this rejection of the applicability of international law, and the media go along with that, and we'll call the territories disputed territories, or they'll say that Israel has repeatedly offered concessions to the Palestinians, and it's just ahistorical and it's false.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm a little bit of a neophyte here. Like I'm still a little bit confused about um, the United States role, and here's why I say that. Like if this was in um, I don't know, Uzbekistan or something, if it was somewhere else, like we there are lots and lots and lots of people that say we have no business being there, we have no business being involved in this, but because it surrounds this place called Jerusalem, is
Right.
that really the driving factor, is the religious component in the United States of why we have entered in this, or is there another power play going on? It's just really
Well, if we're going back to the origins again, anti-Semitism was a huge factor.
okay.
Sad enough to say, but if you look at it, if you go back to the history, Palestine pre-Zionist movement was actually a place of refuge for Jews relative to the rampant anti-Semitism in Europe. And this was one of the reasons that Europeans supported the Zionist movement, including Germany. Germany actually had a pact with the Zionist movement,
Wow.
the transfer agreement, where they supported this emigration of Jews to Palestine, and of course other Western European governments had similar motives, because anti-Semitism was
I did
rampant,
hear
not just in Germany but throughout Europe.
that a major reason for the accords in Britain was because to get rid of the Jewish people there in Britain. They wanted a place for them to go. There was a
Yeah, so they
problem.
were happy for the Jews to leave Europe and to resettle in Palestine. That was one, this is actually acknowledged by the British government itself. If you look at there, because as a result, because as I said, Arabs and Jews actually got along pretty well as neighbors. They had amicable relations prior to the Zionist movement, and this is acknowledged by the British government because after the Zionist movement, and the belligerent occupation that the British were enforcing, there was a number of major outbreaks of violence, 1920, 1921, and 1928. There were major riots in which Jews were murdered. And so the British government had these commissions of inquiry into each of those outbreaks of violence, looking at the question of what is the root cause, like what is the cause of this violence. And they determined that it's not as a result, contrary to the Zionist propaganda narrative, again, it's not a result of inherent Arab hatred of Jews, but rather the growing awareness among the Arab population that the Zionists aimed to dispossess them of their land and ultimately to expel them. And so this was the cause of the Arab resentment towards the Jewish communities, and specifically towards the Zionist Jewish communities. And in fact, the British government drew a distinction between the Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish communities. And in the non-Zionist Jewish communities, the Arabs got along fine with the Jews, and in fact benefited from the Jews being there, because of course, Jewish immigrants from Europe brought wealth with them, and Arabs could find employment in the non-Zionist Jewish colonies. And so, and the British government pointed out how in these colonies, in the non-Zionist colonies, Arabs and Jews actually got along fine, and the Arabs acknowledged having benefited from the Jewish immigration, whereas the Zionist colonies, the Zionist organization had a policy of, number one, acquiring land by exploiting feudalistic Ottoman land laws that didn't recognize the property rights of the people, of the Arabs living on the land and who had homesteaded the land, and so in purchasing that land out from underneath its rightful owners, by buying it up from these absentee landlords. So that was number one. That's how much of the land was acquired by the Zionist organization. And then having this policy of, in many cases, they expelled Arab villages from that land after purchasing it from the absentee landlords, and then also denying Arab employment in those Jewish colonies. So this was a stark contrast between the Zionist communities and the non-Zionist colonies.
Right.
So the British pointed this out as an example of it's that the problem isn't that the Arabs just hate Jews. That's not the issue. The issue is they recognize that the Zionists aim to completely dispossess them and deny them their property rights, their civil rights, their political rights, and ultimately to expel them. Which the British government also pointed out that the Zionists weren't keeping that a secret. Like they were openly proclaiming their intention to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state, which of course the Jews at the time were a small minority. Even by the end of the mandate, they only were about a third of the population and had managed to acquire less than 7% of the land in Palestine. Arabs owned more land in every single district in Palestine, and that included Jaffa, which included the main Jewish population center of Tel Aviv. And
Wow.
this is why the so-called partition plan was completely inequitable. The partition plan consisted of a rejection of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, and in fact, there was actually there was a majority and a minority opinion in the commission that came up with the partition plan, and the minority view was that this whole plan is contrary to the UN Charter, which, because of course, the Charter recognizes the right of peoples to self-determination. And that plan, by the way, was never implemented. This is a myth that the UN created Israel. Again, Resolution 181 neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for its unilateral declaration.
So another question that I have, again as a neophyte, like where because I've heard that there's no real boundaries to Israel.
Correct.
That's never been established. So how does that work, and what does that even mean? That's a little bit confusing to me.
Well, it's there's this is another part of the mythical narrative is that after May 14th, 1948, with that unilateral declaration that the Arab states invaded Israel. The problem with that narrative is that Israel did not exist as a legally defined political entity. There was no state. There was no legally defined state of Israel. Again, this was a unilateral declaration. It had no significance in terms of law. And so what really happened was, and again, already by that time, 250,000 Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed from their homes. And so what happened was that the Arab states, the neighboring Arab states, intervened into Palestine to stop the ongoing ethnic cleansing. And that resulted, by the end of the hostilities, in the Palestinians remaining within just 22% of their historical homeland.
Right.
So the West Bank and Gaza constitute about 22% of historic Palestine. And so the Palestinians' acceptance of the two-state solution since 1988 is in itself actually a huge concession on the part of the Palestinian leadership. It's a major concession for them to say, we'll accept a state in just 22% of our historic homeland. That's already a huge concession. And yet you hear, through the peace process that Israel has made all these great concessions to the Palestinians, which mean ultimatums to surrender more of their rights.
Okay, so tell me about Hamas, because there's because for a long time it was really the PLO that were running things there, and it seemed like once every 5 years, once a decade or so, there seemed to be some progress or something was happening, and there was always conflict, but there seemed to be some progress, and then the PLO was rejected. Hamas came in, and is that really a backlash from Israel constantly rejecting the concessions that the Palestinians were making?
Yeah, we have to keep in mind, particularly with the nature of the media reporting today, and supposed analyses that we see in the media. We have to remember that Hamas is a consequence and not a cause of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hamas is a consequence, not a cause of the conflict. And in fact, when Hamas was first established in 1988, which is the same year that the PLO officially accepted the two-state solution, Israel actually supported Hamas as a counterforce against the PLO, precisely because the PLO was now threatening Israel with the prospect of peace. The PLO was saying, we are a peace partner. It had gained legitimacy in the eyes of the international community as a peace partner, as a party willing to negotiate and come to a reasonable agreement and a solution involving both a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. The problem was that, again, Israel rejected the two-state solution, and so the Palestinian leadership's acceptance of that solution was a threat to Israel.
Yeah.
And so to prevent any movement towards a peace agreement, Israel supported Hamas to divide the Palestinian leadership and to undermine the Palestinian authority, or the PLO, which I almost said the Palestinian, I almost misspoke. It said Palestinian Authority, just to distinguish the Palestinian Authority is a sub-organization of the PLO that was established under the Oslo Accords.
Okay.
And the purpose, while I'm on the point, the purpose of the PA under the Oslo Accords was to act as Israel's collaborator in enforcing its occupation regime. And this is why, which was recognized, became increasingly recognized by the Palestinians, that this was the true function of the Palestinian Authority. And that's one of the reasons why Hamas, starting in 2004 through 2005, was winning municipal elections. And in 2006, won parliamentary elections as well. And that's how the Hamas-led government came into power. Stepping back a bit, starting in 2004, there was a dramatic shift in Hamas policy, where the Hamas's founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, had announced that Hamas was willing to accept a Palestinian state alongside Israel with a 10-year truce to establish mutual intent and recognition. And so here you had Hamas actually moving, like the PLO before it, moving away from armed conflict toward political engagement and diplomacy. And this too posed a threat to Israel, and Israel's response to this shift in policy away from extremism and toward moderation. Israel's response to that was to assassinate Sheikh Yassin. Which ensured the continued radicalization of Hamas, and then coming to the 2006 electoral victory. So Hamas was actually participating in the politics, and it participated in democratic elections and won. And so you had a Hamas-led government in the occupied territories. And what happened next was that is what is described in the Zionist mainstream narrative as a Hamas coup in Gaza. That Hamas violently expelled Fatah, which was the opposing party of PA President Mahmoud Abbas, from the Gaza Strip, and that's why we have this division. That's false. Again, it's just ahistorical. What actually happened was that the U.S. and Israel conspired with Abbas and Fatah to overthrow the Hamas, the elected Hamas government. So what Hamas did in Gaza was actually a counter coup, and this included the U.S. arming Fatah's special forces specifically for the purpose of overthrowing the Hamas-led government. And so what you had was that Fatah tried to overthrow the Hamas government, and Hamas fought back and expelled Fatah from the Gaza Strip. And that's why you have this division of leadership, where the PA remains in control in the West Bank, whereas in the Gaza Strip, you have Hamas in power. So this is the true history. This is what really happened. And again, you can see how Hamas came to power in Gaza precisely as a consequence of Israel's policies.
I was going to ask, how strong is that ultra right wing end of Israel's politics? Because, I know Netanyahu was in trouble, and there's some conspiracies about the timing of all of this. But is there is it for example, is it strong in numbers? Is it strong in power? Why does this Zionist strong right wing political faction have such a root in Israel still?
That's a really good question. I don't really understand it myself, because my understanding is that a majority of Israelis are actually opposed to Netanyahu's policy. In fact, there was described as a judicial coup, where Netanyahu was trying to revise, essentially, it's referred to as a constitutional crisis in Israel, where it was trying to basically undermine the authority of the judicial branch to be able to make it less of an obstacle, so that the judiciary was less of an obstacle to the advancement of the extreme Likud agenda, which is kind of a continuation of the policy implemented under Ariel Sharon with what's called the disengagement plan, where, again, here's the propaganda narrative that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and all it got in return was incessant rocket fire from Hamas.
Right.
Which, again, it's ahistorical. So what the disengagement plan really was a shift, where Israel was going to shift resources from trying to maintain its occupation on the ground in Gaza to basically saying, we give up on Gaza. We're just going to basically establish, just create this ghetto over here in this corner of Israel, of Eretz Israel. and this can be the Gazan ghetto. And then we're going to focus our efforts on annexing as much land in the West Bank as possible. So it was just a shift in resources, and while also granting political coverage for the international community by expressing goodwill of like, oh, we're going to withdraw out of the goodness of our hearts. Um, and so this is basically a continuation, of the continued expansion of Israeli settlements, which are illegal. They're a violation of international law. You mentioned it as apartheid. That's accurate, and increasingly today, international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, UN agencies, Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, all recognize the Israeli policies toward the Palestinians as the crime of apartheid. So that's accurate.
Okay, well, I'm glad I used the proper phrasing of that. It's I want to talk a little bit about Netanyahu because, again, I don't know Israeli politics well, but and again, just full disclosure, what got me onto this was this last attack. It has not been a comfortable thing, I think, for a lot of people to like delve into this history and try to understand, what you knew you didn't know. That's not a fun thing to do. But when I saw that the troops, were held back for hours, I turned to my wife and I said, they let them in. I said, they absolutely let them in. They let their people get slaughtered. And I can't have a morally neutral stand on this anymore. I got to figure out what's going on. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And so I'm brand new to this, but I think there's a lot of people in that same boat. So I want to talk a little bit about Netanyahu and his role, not just in the attack, but also, as a leader of Israel for so long. I mean, he's been there for decades. What has been his role in suppressing the peace process and not letting this happen?
Well, the peace process has been dead for as long as he's been in power.
Okay.
And that was the intent. It was to kill the peace process, which they succeeded in. But speaking to that point, a lot of my own readers have this belief, share the belief, and it's also my understanding that at least a certain segment of the Israeli population has this sense that the attacks were allowed to occur to create a pretext. For what exactly, I'm not entirely sure. But I actually don't. I'm open to that possibility, but I don't believe that to be the case.
Okay.
Because to me, it's believable that there was a true intelligence and military failure, precisely because of Netanyahu's policies, which include, the strategic use of Hamas, where Netanyahu essentially treated Hamas as a strategic ally, again, for the purpose of making sure that it had no peace partner. And, the view of the Netanyahu government was that Hamas was contained in Gaza, which is the world's largest open-air prison, under a 16-year illegal blockade that's designed to collectively punish the Palestinian population of Gaza for the crime of having Hamas as their leadership. And then again, just advancing this kind of, the Sharon's disengagement plan. The aim of that plan of just really annexing more and more land, de facto annexation of more and more land in the West Bank. And this included a shift of even an additional shift of resources where, like soldiers were pulled off of the armistice line along Gaza and shifted into the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was, and then also the judicial coup, as it's called by its opponents in Israel, also led to dissent within the ranks of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, where soldiers were protesting,
wow,
and not showing up for duty. Like they were refusing duty. As a result of this. Yeah. So this is what I mean. Like when I say that I don't fully understand it myself, how Netanyahu wields so much power in Israel, because he's not popular and his popularity has since plummeted. he's more unpopular now than ever. Um, and so I just don't see a motive for his government to have facilitated the attacks.
Mhm.
I don't see it. In fact, to me, it's a huge setback for his political agenda. And so this is why I don't agree with that view that, which although I know it's popular, I have had many readers express to me that they believe that it was somehow facilitated and
Oh,
allowed to
that's fair
happen.
enough. Listen. I'd rather it not be right.
Yeah, and to say something else about it, I think it's partly just trauma. Like there's this belief in everyone who has expressed that view to me among my own reader community. They have this belief of the IDF and the Israeli intelligence services as these just like immensely powerful and
Right,
forces, and
Mossad second to the CIA, right?
they can't imagine that Israel's Mossad agency didn't see it coming, or that the IDF couldn't respond to stop it. Um, and I think it's kind of in a way, kind of a mythical view of Israel's intelligence and military,
Okay.
that they're not as they're not as competent as people think.
Okay. Well, listen, that's good. Like it would be bad if they just let him in. That would not be
Yeah,
a good thing.
yeah, and if I could see a motive and somebody could kind of produce some kind of argument where I could be persuaded, I'm open to it, but I'm just not seeing it.
But just like, and I will say two things. Just like 9/11, like you can say that's an inside job, you could say it's not, but what you can't say is that it was properly run, that the right things were done, and you can't say that the attacks and the things that happened after it, just like 9/11, were the right things to do. And so the response has been absolutely abhorrent, just like the U.S. response to 9/11 was absolutely abhorrent.
Yeah, and in the case of 9/11, I will say that in that case there is abundant evidence of foreknowledge
Mm-hmm.
on the part of the government, as well as facilitation of the attacks, which is a different story. So yeah, it's not.
Yeah, yeah, I know that's true. um, okay, so talk about oh, I wanted to ask because again, kind of bring it back home a little bit. Um, you know, I know there are people that are today still getting selective service letters. People are worried about World War III. We have a proxy war going on with Ukraine. The Warhawks are trying to get China to attack Taiwan for us, and now this happens. In your opinion, like, are we as close as ever to World War III? Are we like what? Tell me like the overall, like, how worried should we be at this moment in time from your perspective?
Well, this speaks to the question again of, or to the kind of interesting relationship between the Christian Zionists in the U.S. and the extreme ultra Orthodox settler Jewish community. And the big risk I see is that ultra Orthodox Jewish community is going to carry through its threat to destroy the Al Aqsa Mosque, or the and also there's the Dome of the Rock Mosque, in the what's called the Temple Mount, and the Israelis refer to it as the Temple Mount, or the Al Aqsa Mosque compound is what Palestinians refer to it as. If that were to occur, it's the intent on the part of the Christian Zionists to to usher in Armageddon. This is their purpose. And in fact, when I refer to the red heifers, the four red heifers, those were delivered to Israel by Christian Zionists in the U.S. And that transfer was facilitated by the U.S. State Department working with the Israeli government.
Really?
Yes, and so you have this situation where there are people who are literally trying to create the situation where they're trying to create the end of times. They're trying to bring about Armageddon. And so when you have this type of power, like they're actively trying to bring about Armageddon. They want to them, it's just a fulfillment of prophecy. And one of the unique aspects of, again, speaking to how anti-Semitism is a big part of the cause of this problem, not just during the mandate era, but today still, I mean, you have there's this belief that during the end times and this war, this Armageddon, that all but like 144,000 Jews are going to be massacred. And so you have
Right.
Christian Zionists who are actually like trying to bring about this war of end times in which they know that there's going to be this genocide of Jews, and they're allied with these, the Zionist Jewish community in Israel for the purpose of
Jeremy,
bringing
that's
about this Armageddon. I mean, it's crazy, and that's a frightening situation, I think, especially when
yeah.
you see like the U.S. government and the Israeli government like facilitating.
When it becomes public policy to
Right, right, and again, this again speaks to why Hamas, because Hamas had been, Hamas routinely honors ceasefires. At the time of when it was involved in the elections, when I was, in 2005, 2006, it was honoring a ceasefire. Um, Prior to Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, there was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. It was honored by Hamas. It was violated by Israel. And all the details of all of this are in my book, Obstacle to Peace, meticulously documented. And again, prior to Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Hamas was, relatively quiet. Um, and so, if you look at why did they call it that? Why was it called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood? I mean, this is why. I mean, they saw, and this was also accompanied by Israeli soldiers accompanying ultra Orthodox Jews to the Temple Mount, preventing Palestinians from entering the mosque and allowing Jews to worship there, which is contrary to the status quo of the mosque, which is actually under the authority of a Jordanian authority. And so, you can kind of begin to understand why Hamas chose this time to launch this operation.
well, isn't I mean, I'm having a shadow memory here. I mean, from a Muslim point of view, wasn't at one point the Ayatollah trying to do the same thing? Back in the day, or maybe he still is. We're trying to bring on Armageddon. I mean, are these like two holy wars gonna? I mean, this is maybe I'm mistaken, but I have this shadow memory of that happening. If you have these two conflicting things going on at the same time, that's not good. No bueno.
Yeah, I mean, the Quran and the Christian Bible have some similarities in that they both speak of end times and kind of a I think there's some kind of major war at the end of times. Although I could be mistaken. It's been a long time since I've actually read the Quran, and I'm not familiar enough with various factions within Islam to know whether
Sure.
whether there's kind of a parallel between the kind of the evangelical Christian interpretation of the the New Testament and the Old Testament, and maybe there's something there. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough, but
Okay, that's fair enough. I remember, again, this could be also media propaganda, anti-Muslim, which happens a lot. That was a big theme of the early 2000s, I think. Um, all right, so Jeremy, again, I really want to appreciate you coming on And If Love Remains. Your book, Obstacle to Peace. I want to finish this. If you were king of the world, what? Or let me ask it a different way. What do you see a way that there could be a solution for peace? If people repented and changed their ways, like how could there be a true solution where we're sitting right now?
step one, U.S. support for Israel's crimes against the Palestinians must come to an end, and that's up to us as Americans, for those of us who are Americans, to accomplish that. We really need to effect a paradigm shift so that it is no longer politically feasible for the U.S. government to continue that policy. And once U.S. support for Israel's crimes ends, that will be a watershed event that will facilitate moves forward to a truly just peace. And at this point, there's just increasing support for what's called the one-state solution, where the vision is a single democratic state in which Jews and Arabs have equal rights under the law. And I think that's an admirable aim. I think that's what the best goal would be. However, the question is, how do we get there? And so the
Right.
first thing is, ending, for example, the U.S. use of its veto in the Security Council to protect Israel, and to ensure that Israel is able to continue carrying out war crimes in Gaza. That needs to stop. Those kinds of things need to stop, and there needs to be accountability. The U.S., instead of opposing, should support efforts, for example, to support investigations by the International Criminal Court into accusations of war crimes by both Hamas and other armed factions in Gaza and the Israeli Defense Forces. The U.S. should be supporting that investigation rather than opposing it.
Right.
The U.S. should support efforts to bring legal questions to the International Court of Justice, which in 2004 did, at the request of the UN General Assembly, did issue a ruling affirming the illegality of Israel's settlement regime, as well as the wall, the separation barrier that is building in the West Bank, is completely illegal under international law. So if the U.S. would stop trying to prevent international law from being applied to the conflict, that would be a huge shift. And that's absolutely necessary. We're never going to have any movement toward any kind of real peace or justice as long as the U.S. continues to just block any kind of effort to hold the Israeli government accountable for its crimes. So that's really, if we can get to that point, that'll be a huge change. And we need to do everything we can to try to, number one, educate ourselves about the true nature of the conflict, and recognize that there's a Zionist propaganda narrative, and then there's the actual historical truth and the historical reality. And then in just sharing that knowledge with others. And it's a really hard thing because, there's so many, just talking about this issue brings up just emotional reactions in people.
Oh, for sure.
And just in the last 3 weeks, I've lost so many subscribers from my newsletter. For speaking out against the crimes on both sides. Obviously, the Hamas terrorist attacks of 10/7 were a horrific atrocity, and there's no justification for it. But at the same time, what Israel is doing in Gaza is also a horrific atrocity of an incomparably greater scale, that is being rightly described as implementation of a policy with genocidal intent.
Yeah, that's, I mean,
Palestinians
that's a
are being
strong
massacred
statement.
and starved. There's a trickle of humanitarian aid that in the past week has been allowed in, but it's horrific. What's happening on the ground in Gaza is horrific,
Yeah.
and there are people who support it. There are people, like, when I speak out against that, and I have readers on my newsletter mailing list who they just believe that the U.S. must support Israel, and it's just like unconditional, and so they're like, they think that what Israel is doing is the right thing, and they have this defense of Israeli war crimes. And you got to get, there are people like that, like, who just refuse to acknowledge it. To them, it's like good Israel versus evil Palestinians, and there's just people who hold this view, and it's hard to get through to people like that. But
It is, and I think one of the biggest tropes that you see out there around surrounding this is people say, well, what is Israel supposed to do? What is Israel supposed to do?
Right. Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
let's start by, the Palestinians are using people as human shields, and well, then let's not bomb the human shields. I mean, you have them there. Like, I don't understand the problem.
If I might speak to that real quick, because that's a really
Please.
important point about how, that is the narrative, is that, well, Palestinian civilians only die because they're being used by Hamas as human shields. Of course, that same claim was made throughout Operation Cast Lead, which I documented in just extensive detail in Obstacle to Peace. And in fact, international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as numerous UN inquiries, including a UN fact-finding mission headed up by a self-described Zionist, looked at Israel's allegations and scoured Israel's own, the IDF's own investigations that it put out, in which it made all these claims of Palestinian civilians being used by Hamas as human shields. And there wasn't a single documented instance of civilians dying during Operation Cast Lead not a single documented instance where civilians died during that operation because they were being used by Hamas at the time as human shields.
It's
They
just,
did, however, document the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields by Israeli soldiers on the ground in Gaza.
are you serious?
Yes.
Wow.
And so this is, again, this is the nature of the media reporting and government claims and the claims of like ardent Zionists who, just defend everything Israel does unconditionally. And it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter what Israel does. It's like they refuse to acknowledge any wrongdoing on the part of Israel. And everything that Israel does is justified and defensible. And I hate to break their bubble, but it's indefensible and it's completely unjustifiable.
And we talked about that, the apartheid status of the people in Gaza right now, especially, but also on the West Bank. What another kind of claim that Israel makes is that, well, Arabs in Israel have all the equal rights and have, and granted, they do live better lives than a lot of places, and that's fair enough, I suppose. But is it true that they do have equal rights, and why, if that is the case, why are they denying the people in Gaza those same rights?
You mean the 20% of Israel's population that's Arab?
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's not true that they have equal rights. They're actually discriminated against. And this is, if you look at what Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and UN agencies have said about the apartheid regime, it's not, they're not only referring to, of course, it's much, much worse in the occupied territories, but there's also discrimination within Israel itself against the Palestinian population, in which, of course, it's only 20% because of the ethnic cleansing that occurred, in which 450 or so villages of the Arabs were literally wiped off the map in order for the Jewish state to be established, which is why there's only 20% of Israel's population that remains Arab today. And, again, leading up to the 10/7 attacks, with this, the judicial reform that Netanyahu was trying to implement, and, the so-called constitutional crisis in Israel with what, its opponents were describing as a judicial coup. There's been just increased attacks on Palestinian civilians, or citizens of Israel, where Palestinian citizens are afraid to go out at night. There's been murders regularly, according to, I just watched an interview, a discussion, a lecture by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who wrote the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And he was describing the situation where there's daily murders of Palestinians living, Israeli Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel.
Yeah.
And so it's increasingly a situation of, that those citizens are also experiencing this apartheid regime. So it's not just limited to the occupied territories.
Jeremy, I want to sincerely, this has been really enlightening to me. And I hope for my audience that you go check out jeremyrhammond.com. Is that correct?
Yes.
And check out his book, Obstacle for Peace. And, and as he mentioned, one of the, I guess, benefits, I would never call the American empire a benefit, but one of the benefits is that you can actually, maybe do something about this as far as like, getting people elected and encouraging your Congress people to stop support of Israel and start an actual peace process to begin. So I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you come back on End of Love Remains. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Sure. I've enjoyed it as well. Thank you for having me on.
Mike is gone.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Gone but not forgotten.
First of 23 installments requested by Dr. Levitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization